The effective interview strategies involve thinking about panel or group, shifting the way that you respond to account for the different people if you are being interviewed by a number. And also the idea that there's a line to walk between being prepared and showing your preparation for the interview and being natural, right? Of not wanting to come across as artificial, but not wanting to come across as so casual that you don't seem like you care or have an investment in the interview process. So we talked a little bit about some of the ways you can prepare good questions. Again, one thing that you should be doing for this interview is when you're an interviewee, prepare questions for the employer. Have a set of questions that you're ready to ask them. You're probably not going to get to all of them, but asking questions that are content-oriented, that are about the job, that show that you've done your homework and research, or that tee up responses where you can show skills that you don't otherwise have are really useful. So for today, we'll be talking about a few other things you can do in order to prepare with kind of an eye toward the things you can do in developing the interview guide and brief for this upcoming assignment. We'll discuss some of the ways to frame your opening and closing of an employment interview, and we'll also be looking at an example where we kind of break down some of the strategies used to answer questions, some of the strengths and weaknesses. And then we'll have a good block of time for you to, again, work with your partner or to prepare on your own for the employment interviews too. So as you're getting ready, again, we'll have these interviews starting on Friday and then going all of the following week. It's important to make sure that you and your partner are both aware of the position, right? So both you and your partner can interview for different positions. So maybe you're really interested in, becoming a marketing executive, and your partner is really interested in a lawyer. That's okay, right? You can interview for different things, but it is a good idea to make sure that your partner has relevant information about the kind of position. For example, you could post a link to the kind of position that you would be applying for and show them sort of the style that might be looked for there. You might also share information about yourself, such as a resume that helps them to prepare and kind of know what to expect from questions, and just anything else that you feel like would give them insight and information about what it is that you would be applying for. You don't need to turn that information into me. It's just designed to help your partner out so that they are as informed as possible. My advice is to be specific. This isn't necessarily a position you would end up applying for. Your interest might change, but this is a great way to practice interviewing for something as specific as possible. For instance, you could even look at a possible position that you're interested in or might be interested in the future and practice like interviewing for that specific position. So you can go as specific as you want here, and I encourage you to make sure to communicate with your partner. And as you are learning about your partner and some of the things that your partner wants to do, I want you to consider structure here. What are the kinds of questions that would make sense to ask? If I was an employer here, what would I want to make sure that the interviewee knows or that I understand about the interviewee? And what possible probes and follow-up questions would I have, right? Again, follow-up questions, probes, digging into details about the interviewee is especially important for this interview because it gets us details and information we don't otherwise have. It's also something that we find in professional settings. We're put on the spot a little bit and forced to kind of answer questions that might be seen as a little bit difficult than what we might become prepared with. So having follow-ups and probes is a great way to help in that process. So I want to share what I think are some commonly asked interview questions, but I do want to make sure to share them with a caveat, right? Caveat being that doing well in this interview does not involve kind of copy pasting these questions. Instead, think about some of these questions as a starting point, right? You have a set of questions that you could ask in your interview, but you might think about how you're tailoring and making these questions more specific to the position itself that somebody is applying for, right? Tell me about yourself is a very common question asked opening and framing for interviews. It's a chance for the interviewee to share a little bit about their background and to kind of acclimate themselves. So one really key function of tell me about yourself as an interview question is not that it's somebody shares their story and it moves on. It's a chance for a probe, right? It's a chance for an interviewer to hear a detail. So perhaps somebody is talking about their experience and they say, and then I interned for the Oregon State Legislature, and After that, they say, oh, well, tell me more about this internship that you had with the legislature. I'd love to hear more about it, because that's a detail they shared about themselves that's relevant to the position. So you can think about it as kind of filtering out, right? Or you're kind of like raking the sand to find the gold. You're getting the information within this very broad question. One challenge as an interviewee with this type of question is that you don't want to go on and share information that's irrelevant, that's really kind of broad and doesn't actually connect to the position properly. If you're talking about how, the other day, your dog ran across the street and went into a river and you had to dig him out, getting into that level of detail is probably not relevant to the job. The other thing to think about here, right, is that while you're submitting a resume, cover letter, you're submitting the relevant material for the job, it's not coalescing into a full story until you do the interview. Sometimes your cover letter does share kind of your story and your experience, what got you to the point that you're at. But think about it this way. The employer has already seen your resume. They've already seen the basic information. You can do some reminders about that information. But what you should really be doing is taking the information that they have about you and putting it together in a story. I want to tell you about how I grew up in Idaho. I didn't think college was for me. I had the chance to come to OU. I really found a passion for psychology, right? Sharing your story and sharing that in a memorable way and connecting the dots is something that can really help here. Why do you want to work for us? Answer should not be money. Answer should be that there are specific things about the position that you think are a good fit. Rather than saying, I want this job because I can do X, Y, Z, or I think I can, right, with using I framing, I, me. Think about it as us, we framing. So whenever you can frame your response as, well, I think we would be able to work really well together. I think that my experience will help us to improve. Showing how you fit in, kind of like a jigsaw puzzle, is a really good way to frame. Strengths and weaknesses, right? So, being honest about things you're really good at, and when you have a strength, tying it to a specific example or experience can be really good. I would say that I'm very good at being detail-oriented. For example, I manage a spreadsheet that deals with our club's budget really effectively and has helped us to save a lot of money. One thing to think about that's common as a weakness is identifying something that is sort of a strength in its own right. So for instance, you might say, sometimes I can be a little bit too detail oriented and, I'm trying to work on that. Or sometimes I need to work on my work-life balance and, cut off answering emails by 5 p.m., right? So sometimes framing weaknesses is framing something that you're good at or you're doing well, you're just modifying that. One trick with a weakness is to say what it is that you're doing to address that weakness. Because if you're showing, I understand that I have this issue or this weakness, but I'm working on it, that looks a lot better than to say, oh yeah, well, I'm interviewing for this job, and honestly, I'm really bad at answering emails, and sometimes I come in late to work because my alarm doesn't go off, right? That's a red flag. Instead of saying that, you might say, I have had some challenges with organizing my schedule in the past, but I've developed a new planner and a new system that has worked really well. Short and long-range career goals. So this is an important question because you want to think here. In a lot of positions you're applying for at this stage, right? You're applying for stepping stones. You're applying for jobs that are not necessarily what you're going for longer term, but you see them as a great way to explore new opportunities or consider that path, right? Having been on the other side, one thing that a lot of people look for when they're fielding applicants is to say, well, who would benefit from this job, right? Who is getting something out of this job that they feel like is relevant to their career? So if you say, my terminal goal is to become a lawyer, but I think that this internship is a great way there because it gives me experience in X, Y, Z. It's a really good way to show the relevance of this to your information. Also, sometimes you're going to ask about leaving. So if you see question marks, gaps, or issues in a resume, sometimes you want to understand why. Somebody was only in a position for a couple months. You want to understand what was going on there. Their feelings about their current position. So one thing to consider here is always to ask yourself, why is it that somebody is coming into this job if they already have a job? And then what is it that's motivating that switch? Sometimes people are applying to jobs in bad faith. They're not applying to jobs because they really want the job. They want the job, or they're applying because they want interviewing experience, or perhaps they're trying to negotiate an offer to get a raise at their current job. So making sure that you understand some of their reasoning, and as an interviewee, explaining your interest and the fact that you're serious is important. If you're not serious about the job, you don't intend to accept, get it, you're kind of wasting everybody's time. Why should we select you over other applicants, right? This is a chance for you to make your pitch and to talk about the things that are specific to you and your personality that you feel like could uniquely qualify you to the job. And also asking what do you know about this organization is important, right? If you are concerned that the interviewee doesn't understand the position, you want to make sure that that question is asked. You can mix this question if it's really clear that they understand the job and they are showing that knowledge in the early interview responses. But I think it's important to use this question if you have concerns about the interviewer's preparation. So these questions are starting points, right? They're backup questions you can consider, but what I encourage you to do is to consider some of these questions and really, as an interviewee, be prepared for these types of questions whenever applying for a job. But as an interviewer, you might consider how you can make these questions a bit more specific. So for instance, if somebody is asking about career goals, you might instead frame the question as, this internship is really designed as an opportunity for college students who are interested in a career in law. How might this internship help you, right? Where you're getting at this kind of question, but you're doing so in a much more focused way, right? The more generic your questions are, the more generic your responses are. So being cognizant of that helps us to make sure our questions are specific to the needs of the hiring committee or employer who is able to get the information you need. The worst feeling as an interviewer is to come in out of the interview and say, oh, there's more I wish I knew about this candidate before I can make a confident decision about it. So think about this as literally getting your questions answered as an interviewer. Also, you'll find yourself as an interviewee faced with questions that you might not have had time to think about or prepare for, right? And that's okay. In fact, being asked to think on your feet is a good skill to develop for interviewing. One thing that I always encourage is we don't like gaps, we don't like silence. It can be uncomfortable, but give yourself 2 or 3 seconds, take a breath, make sure you fully understand the question. Sometimes I will write down the question as I'm being asked the question, because the worst feeling in the world is to say just random stuff for a minute and then say, wait, what was the question? Right? Or could you rephrase the question? Make sure you fully understand the question before you start to talk, and that'll make sure your answers are a lot more focused. So when you're thinking about, we talked about some of the nonverbal things that you could do, right? But verbally, there are a few strategies that I think are really important for responding to interview questions effectively. One of them, as mentioned, is to use pronouns, right? Use us, we language versus I, me language. Generally speaking, employers don't want to hire somebody that they think is going to be kind of self-centered, self-serving, is going to throw other people under the bus. Really talking about this as, we understand what your need is. I'm coming in to help to fulfill and have us work together in a collaborative way, right? It's not, I'm a great person, here's why you should hire me. It's, I'm a great addition to this team. Here's why we can work together effectively. Action verbs, right? Really showing your strategies effectively. I organized, I engaged, I outreached, using that type of language to show the actions that you're taking is really good, especially when you're speaking to your experience. So depending on the job that you're applying for, right, the use of technical language and jargon can be useful if the jargon and language you're using is mutually understood. In other words, if you're applying to a job, perhaps in the healthcare field, and you're bringing up experience, perhaps, in law or in sociology that wouldn't be understood by the employer, you want to make sure that you're explaining and breaking down what that terminology is, because they might not get it. But if you're applying to a job and very specifically your previous experience and language is the type of language in the job description or the type of language that you feel like they would understand, that can be a great way to get a leg up because it shows your understanding and knowledge of the issue. For example, you might say, you know, I've worked in payroll, I've worked in Medicaid billing, I've worked in deliverables, EO, like you might use specific acronyms and language that people can better understand and utilize it. So, you know, language like bandwidth, paradigm shift, leading edge. You might also look at your field, right? You might ask yourself, what are some of the language choices that are really popular or well-known in your field, right? This is true of a lot of positions where you want to show that you're kind of in on the various changes and happenings, you're cutting edge. So for instance, you might say, I'm engaged in the idea of disruptive innovation, of really trying to use unique strategies of managing marketing. Or I understand the digital paradigm, the digital shift in PR, right? Showing your interest and knowledge of these issues. Qualifiers, right? So qualifiers include the use of language like sometimes, maybe, probably, usually. Those can convey hesitancy when you're answering questions. So you might say, oh yeah, I'm probably a good fit for this job. That would be concerning, right? You might, because you're probably a good fit. Well, why wouldn't you be? What's going on here, right? You're drawing attention to the word that is kind of mitigating your sentence and undercutting it. So you might say, I think I'm very well qualified for this position. Here's why. So oftentimes we occupy so much space in interview responses with filler words and content that does not help us in the interview. And I know if you're like me, I absolutely hate hearing myself recorded, but doing so is a really good way to see what your responses look like and to see the kinds of words and phrases that you commonly use, because word economy matters. If your interview only has so much time, there's only so much content that you can share and get out there, filler and meaningless words are really going to hurt your ability to get those points out there. If you're taking a minute to essentially clear your throat and get yourself able to get to your main points, you're really going to hurt your quality of responses. So recording yourself, identifying and flagging the filler phrases. One thing that I think can be fun to do with a friend or roommate is every time you use a filler word or phrase, like slam a desk or, you know, hit a buzzer or do something that lets them know that the filler word is being used, that can really help. Positivity and attitude matters a whole lot. Whenever you're talking about and answering job interview questions, it is good for you to show excitement and positivity and interest. That goes a long way, because if you're looking at two candidates, one is qualified but doesn't seem interested, they seem grumpy, they seem difficult, the other person seems really excited, enthusiastic, and interested, you're probably going to hire the more excited candidate because you see them as being a good fit and you see them as coming in with the energy and willingness to do a good job. One thing that comes as part of having a positive attitude is try to avoid speaking about your previous work experience in a negative way, right? So you might say, oh, everything's the worst at my job right now. People are so toxic, and you know, the employment situation is the worst, right? Like you can constructively talk about some of the challenges, but one red flag is, well, if they're saying that about the previous job, what are they going to say and gossip about our job if they take it, right? So showing a positive attitude, framing things in a more constructive way is useful. So being honest about some of the limitations is important here, right? So try to think about this as a learning opportunity. If you made a mistake, right, what did you learn from that experience? What are the steps that you're taking going forward? Again, you might not have some of the experience that they're looking for or the level of experience that they're looking for, but using a hypothetical is a really great way to answer the question. For instance, you might say, well, I've never had experience with filing legal briefs before, but from my experience and my understanding of this, here's how I would tackle it, right? People are much more comfortable hiring somebody who doesn't have the experience if they show the plan and foresight that they would take if they are to address that issue. So think about this as a hypothetical. So your text has a lot of example questions that an employer could ask an employee, and or that can be asked to an employer from an interview. And we went over some possible ones last class. I'm not going to go over all of these, but I do think it's a good example of some of the ways that when you are asked to present questions to an employer, you could do so. For instance, sometimes talking about the culture and background in the location is important. Some of these questions like geography and kind of elements of where the position is located, those are things that oftentimes a job application will include. So I encourage you to cross off questions that you know are already being addressed in other places. One thing you can do, though, is to look at the job description and identify something that's a little bit unclear and ask for clarity about that. So this position says that it works 3 days a week. Typically, what would that 3-day work week look like? Which days would I be working? Talking about some of your future pursuits. If I'm interested in this, would I receive support? Some positions, right, can work well if you're a student, if you're pursuing a degree, and might even offer some additional benefits for doing so. Also, one thing that can really help is, again, employers asking the questions like to talk about themselves and sell their own experience. So asking them a question, what's it like for you working in this organization? What do you enjoy about working here? Those can be really great ways to get people excited and talking and to make it more of a conversation. Talking about challenges, issues can be really useful, right? What have been some of the challenges in the past? What are some of the things that you're looking for is really important. With some of these questions like this one, like what is criterion for selecting candidates? Like what are you looking for, right? One way that you can ask that question is to tee up a response. Say, well, I'm really glad to hear that you're looking for somebody with experience in childcare because I have this experience, here's why, right? And reminding people as to how you meet those qualifications. So there's a lot of options here. Again, you're not limited to these type of questions, but be thinking about how your questions can be both clarifying and also help to highlight some of the things that you uniquely have as a candidate. So I wanted to share an example of a response to interview questions and break down some of the things that I think are and are not effective about this response. So this is kind of a mock interview, and I think is useful for us in thinking about how responses are being used here.
Thank you for coming in today. I'm happy to help you with your interview. Why don't we start by having you tell me a little bit about yourself?
So I'm a senior communications major here at Curry. Anticipated graduation is May of 2015. I have very strong points in working with people. I am very involved here at Curry, so I'm a part of the student activities office. I'm a student worker there. As an orientation leader as well. I have a background in theater. I spent almost half of my life doing theater. I have vocal talents. I've taken voice lessons for 9 years. I don't know what else to say. I don't know.
So, good things that are happening here. First of all, this response does a good job of going into a lot of specific things that he has experience with, but it ends poorly, right? Saying, I don't really know what else to say, or I don't really know what to add here. Don't say that when you're wrapping up kind of a tell me about yourself question. Making sure to end it on a specific note is really important to make sure that it summarizes your key points. Some of the points as well here, right? It kind of feels a little bit like a laundry list. He's just going over various qualifications and background that he has, things that he's done. It's not really being very closely linked to the position. So make sure that you're bringing these points back and you're being really clear as to why something like vocal talents would be relevant.
I'm trying to go back.
Overall, really good. I think he did a really nice job of showing both your background, but also some interest. It really helps to paint a picture of who you are as a person. I think what you need to be careful of, and what is a common mistake, is to not just reiterate everything that they're looking at. So once you start to get into then I did a major and I did this job and then before that I did that job, all you're doing is reading your resume to them, and they've already read your resume. That's why they brought you in as a candidate. So you kind of have to think about what your pitch is and what your story is and what is it that I want them to know in the first few minutes of meeting me. And that's really hard. This isn't something that's an easy thing to do, but you want to just try to stay away, and you actually did a good job. I would say you weren't just kind of, I'm from Franklin, Mass, and I went to such and such high school, and then I went to Curry College, and then I did this job. You didn't do that, which was good, but you want to try to stay away from what I kind of would describe as like the chronology of your background and more as a summary of who you are as a candidate, what you're looking for, what your passion lies, as it relates to the position.
Right, so talking about passion, talking about interest, and putting it together in a more narrative way rather than just like listing out is the big thing to avoid in those types of questions.
Or what are the weaknesses that you have?
Weaknesses when things aren't going my way, I tend to like stress myself out to the max, and I just don't know where to go from there. But then when it all comes down to it, I can pick myself back up. And so it's a weakness that builds into a strength.
So weakness that builds into a strength is a good strategy, as we mentioned, right? But this is a kind of tricky response because what it flags to me is, oh, this person is not going to do well in high pressure situations. They say they bring themselves back. How do they do this? So lack of clarity about how they're addressing the issue leaves me concerned. One thing that I would have liked to see from this response is something like, sometimes I get stressed, I get in over my head. But when this happens, one thing that I've done is I've reached out to my employees or I reach out to my supervisor for support, showing that there is a way that he's able to come down and to feel better, right? So while identifying a strength that can be used or a weakness that becomes a strength is helpful, what I'm left with is I don't understand how that weakness becomes a strength. So showing me the steps that you take to improve that is important.
A little bit of a formula that I like students to follow when it comes to answering this question. The top one, it's a three-part. One, pick something that's honest and authentic. So you did that. I didn't get the, I work too hard, right? That's not very authentic. So you did, you picked an authentic weakness. Step two is to not pick a weakness that's going to throw yourself under the bus. So you don't want to say, for instance, you're going to PR, I really don't like working with people. Like that's a weakness that's going to be a deal breaker with industry. Three, you then take it and you talk about how you mitigate the weakness. So that's where the third step I want you to take. So I think you pick.
Yeah, so don't pick a weakness that is like a deal breaker or something that no matter what will not be a good fit. If you're involved in some type of teaching or childcare, I don't like kids, right? Be careful about responses like that just don't fit with what they're looking for.
One and two, but three would be to then say, so typically what I do when I feel myself getting really overwhelmed is I stop, I take a breather, or I begin to write lists, or I figure out a way to organize my day. So that if you were to ask my coworkers, they probably have no idea that I'm like this, but internally this is something that I go through. So these are the things that I do to make sure that it doesn't. Can you give me an example of an accomplishment you've had and felt about you?
So I think one of my greatest accomplishments is the general focus of me going to college, because initially graduating high school, I wasn't planning on going to college. I was a C student in high school, wasn't involved in anything, basically just went to school and left and didn't really do much. And then coming to college, I had that mindset of, I'm just gonna do whatever. And then I got involved on campus. I ended up getting dean's list full semesters my freshman year, and then full semester sophomore year, and then it continued up until my senior year. I made dean's list almost every semester, a couple semesters I haven't, but close enough. I'm extremely involved on campus. I was an orientation leader. I have been involved in Curry Theater, and I'm participating in all of these specific things that go on at Curry, which initially I had no idea or anticipation of me doing anything that I've done at Curry so far. So I think that right there is a great aspect of my life that I initially had never expected.
So one thing that's done really well here, again, is showing a trajectory, a place where somebody is maybe less engaged, less prepared, less informed, right? And over the course of time, they've really kind of applied themselves and developed. That can be a really good way to mitigate weaknesses. For example, if you had to submit your transcripts and they say, oh, wow, as an undergrad or, as a high school student, your grades weren't the best, but they really improved. Why did this happen? Getting involved is useful here. But I think there could be better clarity on the specific things that motivated him to do better, right? So what was it that changed in college? What was the experience that really drove him and got him passionate? And perhaps framing that in a way that connects to the specifics of the job that he's applying for can be a really good way to show that passion to him. So I wanted to show some sample responses to questions, kind of highlight some of the pitfalls and also some of the things that you can do effectively here. Again, I recommend continuing to look through example interviews and example responses to interview questions, because I think seeing it kind of from the perspective of an observer gives us a lot of information about how to interview and engage effectively. That'll be something we'll be able to do in this class too, which I think will help all of us to get better at interviewing as well. And then lastly, before I give you some time to work in groups, one thing to think about is how you're using opening and closing for employment interviews, right? So one way of thinking about this is the entire time you're in any kind of communication with the hiring committee or they have any way of reaching you, you are always on, right? So don't like finish an interview and get on LinkedIn and say, oh, I just had the worst interview ever. I did such a bad job, because perhaps somebody who's your employer or connected to your employer is going to see that. So whenever you're interviewing, you've always got to be on. When I did speech and debate, we had a similar mindset. You have to be on all the time. Sometimes, like when I was judging, like I was in the bathroom and I was judging, and I heard a student in the bathroom say, oh, my other competitor, they're just the worst. I hate their speech, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like judging that student in the next round. And so being really careful. If you do athletics, you might be familiar, extracurriculars, you might be familiar with band talk, right? You're involved in some type of professional representation of yourself. And while you're there, don't speak negatively about anybody until you get in the band, right? And once you're in the band with your colleagues, then you can say whatever you want. Be careful. Showing your interest, checking in about next stages can be really useful. Again, one thing that's really useful is just offering just a brief summary of yourself as a candidate, just to say, you know, at the end of the day, I'm really excited about this opportunity. I think there's a lot that we can work on together as a team, and I look forward to hearing the next steps. And oftentimes an interviewer will agentically, if that's not prompted or questioned by the interviewee, explain what the next steps look like. One thing that's really useful, especially if you're applying to multiple jobs, is immediately after the interview, like open up a tab, and while it's fresh in your head, just type in what worked well, what didn't, what do you feel like did and didn't go effectively in the interview. This is not only great practice for future interviews and helping you to work on things for future interviews, including if you do a practice interview, but second of all, sometimes interviews have multiple rounds, right? Candidates are moved forward. So sometimes when I've interviewed for jobs, I realized there were things about my experience and background that were really relevant that I didn't really get to, I didn't share, or I didn't feel like I answered the best. So in a future interview, I really want to highlight those specific things that I didn't get to as well last time, so I can really emphasize those next time. So be really thoughtful about what it is that you feel like you want to highlight. Also, a really good idea right after the interview to write a thank you email, right? Writing a detailed thank you email where you appreciate the time and work that it took to interview you is really a good idea. First of all, it shows you care. It shows that you're invested and that you appreciate the time and work that went into it. But second of all, it's really useful because it allows you to keep your name in the running, keeps you relevant, right? It allows you to remind them about you as a candidate. And if you have like 3 candidates and only one of them sent a thank you letter, that one of the 3 suddenly looks a lot better as a possible hire. Lastly, it's easy to be frustrated if you don't get a job, if you get a rejection, but you got to do your darndest not to burn bridges and express frustration or to be like, why didn't I get the job? One good rule is give yourself at least 24 hours from when you get a rejection to when you follow up, if you choose to follow up. Because sometimes there's future opportunities, sometimes things change, sometimes people back out, and you find yourself back in the running for something. So before I came to EOU, there was actually a job that I had interviewed for. I was a finalist, and I didn't get the job, and I was very disappointed. About 3 or 4 months later, I get a call, and the hiring manager says, we actually have another position available. would you like the job? And I declined because I already, had landed the EOU job at that point. But burning a bridge means you're just denying yourself a potential future opportunity, whether it be an interview or maybe even being considered again with all the ways that the market and everything else fluctuates. So in our remaining time, take some good time to discuss and confer with your partner in preparation for your employment interviews. If your partner's not here, you can work on your own or reach out to your partner. On your own for attendance, take some time to write or type how you as an interviewer will open and close the interview. How are you kind of preparing and acclimating the candidate for the job that you're interviewing them about? And also, how are you as an interviewee going to work on responding to questions? What are some of the things that you're going to do or avoid doing in light of some of the issues that we talked about together? So take some time to chat with your partner and work on your own on addressing some of these questions.
What's the method of this is trying to well, one and two are like
For friends. Yeah.
Very much.
Have 5 more minutes to continue working and discussing with your partner.
You know, copy. I'll get, you know, there's I'm doing the whole.
Take about 2 more minutes to finish working.
like what they're saying, tell people like, you would get the lines and then like. Some people like halfway down was like, oh, the hospital, it's so upsetting, this could be Ed, would it be? I saw it too. I'm just gonna read it, I'm leaving now early. I know some people. I'm sprayed by 5 minutes. You'll be on, people like, if they were actually like, I was like. You're on mark 1, you're on mark 2. He's always gonna have like. I would have been. And I bet people, I think, I'm telling you, like, there have people that we can help like. Like, because they can get going to one. That's what I. On reality. No, just a look, so that's how they keep going. I was pretty once that way. That was never when I keep going. So like time you miss one, you know, like, I started like doing it like
Yep.
and then I was like, I missed one by a lot, but I tried to run and I missed out.
So finish your discussion with your partner and pass forward or email your attendance for the day. Again, our last chance in class to work with your partner is on Wednesday. Otherwise, I encourage you to reach out through email or set up time outside of class to meet. Today, we took some time to discuss the opening and closing, some of the ways that we can respond to questions effectively in an interview. And I encourage you to prepare for the interview starting on Friday. We'll shift gears a little bit and take some time on Wednesday to talk about performance interviews, not an interview that you'll be asked to give for this class, but one that is good to know and understand that's connected. So again, please pass forward or email. Have a great rest of your morning and see you on Wednesday.
Let's go back one slide just like that.
Yep.
What more? I got the question.
Okay. I have a quick question for the next class, for my presentation. All the ones that you tell me, I can't, they wouldn't open, like I can never find it. So I found this article, and I didn't know if like this was right. Like routes, it just basically talks about he just talks about how the use of like that you look like persuasive language and stuff. Goes into like mind theory and like he kind of just talks about how whether it's found in that like mind to contribute to probably it's like actually it's not, but like because of the language used. Does that make sense?
I think that's great.
Yeah, if you are finding a connection between what this article is saying and rhetoric, like the study of rhetoric.
Yeah.
What wasn't opening your work?
All of these that I like tried to get, and then I tried to use this also, and it was like none of them were available. Like when I would go computer and then like pick one of these, none of them would open, and then I would try to use that website, and it was like we don't have this document. Yeah. Like, yeah,
What about the attachment?
I didn't see one
I'm looking at that.
unless I just like missed it. I only found like those, like there wasn't like any attachment.
Okay, because when I sent the email to you. And I sent it to you and so I'm not sure. I mean, the article that you selected is fine. It'll work for this. I'm like wondering why.
Yeah, on maybe it's because it's like on Canvas, but the attachment did show up. But this, like for my connection to theory, just said that it uses like persuasive language and promoting the idea that mind can reduce poverty. And that like rhetoric theory, so language can be used to influence people's beliefs and behaviors. And then like in the case of mind, poverty reduction, the records around the true benefits of mind should be used to persuade state to support mining projects. Okay, I didn't know if connection to it, like I have more to say like on the cards, but
Sure.
I
Yeah.
wasn't really sure. I had a really hard time like finding a good article that was like,
I wish I knew sooner.
yeah, I was like, tried to do that, but like none of them would open, and I'm like, they tried to open like all of them, and they would open, and I didn't have it.
Like, how was your introduction? Like, how-
Yeah, I
the
would have been
closest.
happy to send
They don't
out.
understand. I'm not
Yeah,
explaining this.
I mean,
It's okay. I think
I
it's
was gonna be
correctly
like, is
enough,
there
but I
any
just
way
wanted to
help
check
you?
if like.
Yeah, this
Code
will work.
connection.
Is there any way I-
Yeah, as long as it's explaining what we learned about rhetoric, what's adding
I
up
need
to
to force
understanding
it.
rhetoric.
Okay.
Then it.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
That's fine. Richie, we all hit it. Okay, stop doing the flip thing and start working on the introduction. And then-